All right. So this is the first in my New Testament history series. So um, the goal of this series is to give a very brief history of the books in the New Testament, including the authorship of the books and the date that they were written. I'll also be giving brief summaries of the books themselves. So it's going to be very much a just snapshot overview of each individual book. So to start us off with here, I'll just define the New Testament. What is the New Testament? The New Testament is what Christians call the second part of their scriptures. The first part being what they call the Old Testament. Jews just call it their Bible. So the Jews have a Bible, which includes books that the most recent book was written, I think, a few hundred years before the New Testament. So their canon is what it's called, is closed at the end of that series of books, which Christians call the Old Testament. And then a few hundred years later, something happens with this guy named Jesus, and people start writing about him. And that starts this sort of new series of writings that the Christians say we're also going to include these in our holy books, our books that are sort of unique in specialness apart from all other writings. These are ones that God really, really wants us to hold dear. So it's those that are called the New Testament. So there's 27 of those books that make up the New Testament. We got one more person we're admitting here. So there's 27 books. My plan roughly is to go over 4 books per week. So it should take us maybe a little bit, about 7 weeks or so.
I'm here.
Hello, Kyle.
I'm walking home. There's probably some wind noise, so I'll probably mute in between.
Yeah, I'll mute you real quick. Thanks. So we're going to take about 4 books at a time. So why do this study? Why look at these books and look at their history, their dating, and their authorship? Well, first of all, it's interesting historically. It's interesting if you are, if you would all take religion seriously or find it of interest. But I think more than anything, the books make some very, very large claims. They talk about a guy that was raised from the dead. They make commands and say people should do this and they shouldn't do that, and there's eternal consequences if they do or don't do certain things. I mean, these books don't just claim to be unimportant or of minor, moderate importance. I mean, these books are saying, hey, the most important truths in the universe are contained in here, which is pretty big. So it would be good to examine those, not just read them, but to look at the background and look at who wrote these, when did they write them. That's going to give you, I think, a good idea of basically whether they're true or not. And so that's why I want to do this study, is to help people assess for themselves, mainly whether their claims are true or not. So I want to make this series accessible to everyone. I want it to be as basic as possible. For people who have never even opened the Bible or any sort of religious text, I want them to be able to join live and possibly watch later if I can get these recordings posted, watch these videos and take away some knowledge that they can just come right in at any point and pick up some important truths. So that's my hope, is to keep it very, very basic. And the order I'll be going in, you can do it a couple of different ways. I'm just strictly going to go in the order that if you cracked open a Bible, the order that a Bible would present them in. So what would be called the canonical order. So that's just the order I'm going to go in. It isn't likely to be chronological. It's not like we're going from first written or most important or even by author, any of that. It's just the order that they are presented in the Bible. And I'll get into, as we go along, kind of why they are chunked the way they are. So eventually I'll post some of the materials I reference. I'll probably post some summaries, things like that. So you can stay up to date on my website, nametheUnknown.com. I will hopefully post some things there as I go through the series. So we'll kick this thing off. I've kind of given you my mission. I'm going to kick this off with my method. And I want to share my method primarily to share how easily this study can be done, because I'm not an academic or really a scholar at all. I'm just a guy interested in these subjects. So part of my goal at Name the Unknown is to encourage other people to take religion seriously. And so I want to encourage other people to do the studies for themselves. And so the work for this type of study is not that difficult. It does take a little bit of time, but it doesn't take a genius. It doesn't take someone with tons of access to rare materials or anything like that. So my method in brief is to look at about 4 to 6 or so of something like this. This is just a dictionary, the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church. Pretty thick. It's got a lot of entries. So to crack open a guy like this, to flip open to Matthew, Gospel of Matthew, and to read the entry in there. It's usually about a page, maybe 2 pages or so of this dictionary. I've got another one, this Dictionary of the Christian Church. If you don't have those sitting around, good news is there's tons of them for free online. So probably the best place to go, I would say, would be studylight.org. They have dictionaries and encyclopedias, and you can just pick one at random and choose the book that you're interested in, or the whatever topic you're interested in, and just read through the entry. Importantly, you don't want to pick just one. I'm doing, like I said, about 4 to 7, which is a bit much. Probably 3, 4 would be perfectly fine to get an idea of the general consensus about whatever subject you're interested in. So that was my method. I have 2. I'm lucky enough to have 2 hard dictionaries in my personal collection, but I used the online materials quite a bit. Bible Hub is another option. It's not, I don't think, as easily navigated for encyclopedias and dictionaries and things. You could also go to Bible Hub and check out encyclopedias and dictionaries, and there's just tons and tons of them. So that's mostly what I do, and then make a list of what each of these encyclopedias or dictionaries say about the dating of this book. What do each of them say about who wrote this book? What do they say is kind of the general summary of this book? I benefit a little because I've read the books that I'm studying. I've read them through and through, at least probably 4 or 5 times. So I benefit a little bit where I can sometimes skim some of that summary material and things, but you should be able to pull a good understanding from that. I also do just a little bit of like supplemental reading if I happen to have like a book laying around that corresponds to the Gospel of Matthew. If I've got a book laying around that's about the Gospel of Matthew or about the Gospels, I might flip through that. Also, on YouTube, there's tons of lectures. You can find lectures. Just search the Book of Romans. Maybe do like a history of the Book of Romans or authorship of Book of Romans, something like that. And just maybe stick to, I would say, lectures. You can find some really well qualified professors on there giving some good stuff. But again, I would say the stuff like that, just supplemental. Like that's just if I've got extra time and I want to kind of build on what I've found in encyclopedias and things, then I'll peruse YouTube and things like that. So that's kind of my method. Hopefully you find that sound, but easy to do yourself. So let's rock with the first 4 books of the New Testament. So the first 4 books are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are all what are called Gospels. The word gospel, as I understand it, it's a literary genre that just basically means a biography of Jesus. So again, as far as I understand it, there are 4 total legitimate literary works that could be considered in the genre of gospel. So obviously, if you think there were other recordings or biographies of Jesus that were by people who would know such facts, then you would say, well, there's maybe more gospels, but so they're all the same genre. So some background timeline as I go through these books here. Jesus' birth is typically, I think, put at 0, which is why the years start over, as we base it on Jesus' birth. There's sort of a new era when Jesus is born, so we're starting over at 0. I think there's a good amount of people that think maybe he was born closer to 3 AD. Doesn't matter too much for the purpose of this study, but we'll just say 0 is when Jesus was born. Jesus started walking around teaching, doing miracles, things like that. They call it his ministry. He started his ministry at about year 30 then. He was born in 0, started his ministry at 30. And then he died, he was crucified in 33. So he had a 3-year ministry, crucified in 33. So we'll just kind of keep those dates in the back of your mind as we discuss the Gospels. So of these 4 Gospels, they are usually broken down and thought of as 2 categories. So 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels, which is a fancy term that just means they all 3 have very similar content. They go over the same scenes, if you will, the same sermons of Jesus, some of the same miracles, just some of the same stuff he did. They cover a lot of the same stuff. I actually told my wife she wants to read through all of the New Testament. And I said, it's for me personally, it's kind of tough starting at Matthew and just reading through Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, because it's like reading the book almost all over again in a lot of ways. It seems like, because so much of it's so similar. A lot of times if I read through the New Testament, I might do Matthew and then go read some other book, and then come back after a while, read Mark, and go read some other, few books, and then come back and read Luke. They're very similar. There's a lot of differences, a lot of content that are unique to each one, but they are very similar. And there's thought to be at least some textual sharing. That's a pretty predominant view, which just means that at least some of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or all of them, they had the texts of one or the other in front of them. So for example, Luke's gospel comes right out at the beginning, and he says, hey, I've talked to people who have seen these events. I've gathered written material about these events. So he's done interviews, he's traveled, he's talked with different people, and he's also gathered some written material. And so Luke says himself, he's using stuff that's written. So whether that's a previously written gospel or not, there's thought to be some sort of kind of textual sharing. They're potentially they potentially are knowledgeable about each other's writings and are keeping those in mind maybe when making their own writings. So that's Matthew, Mark, Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic gospels. And then John all by himself, he doesn't really get a special name, just the Gospel of John. He's sort of in a different category. It's, if you haven't read them, it may be a little misleading because it is very similar. There's still a lot of similar content in there. There is. But there's also a lot of new content, stuff that is not covered in the other Gospels. It's a bit more, it feels a bit more like it's pulling lessons from Jesus' life and ministry. It feels a bit more like the author telling the readers kind of what this means. Whereas Mark and Luke especially are just very much like, here's the stuff that happened. And John feels a little more like you're learning something from the author a bit. Again, it is very historical. You're getting just stuff that was said and stuff that happened. But like if you go through all these encyclopedias and things, they'll all say it's got a little bit more of a theological flavor to that gospel, which just means that it teaches a bit more about God and his plan. It's a little bit more intimate, so the author calls himself the one whom Jesus loved. If it was written by John, this was a very close apostle to Jesus, and so we get a bit more about the life and character of Jesus. Just feels a bit more intimate, feels a bit more passionate. And almost half of John takes place in Jesus' last week alive, which is definitely different from the other Gospels. They might dedicate a couple chapters to the last couple weeks of Jesus' life. But John spends quite a bit of time there at the end of Jesus' life and ministry. And it's thought that maybe John was written specifically for Christians. This kind of goes back to that, it being maybe a bit more teaching in nature. It's thought to maybe have been geared at Christians, maybe to kind of pump them up, to encourage them. So that's the two different categories of the Gospels. So I'll give you we'll start with the summaries of each of these, very, very brief summaries. you might wonder, well, if they're all telling about the same guy in his life, shouldn't the summaries all be about the same? And yes, to an extent, they are all about Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection, his ministry. They are all about that, but it's kind of thought that each author has his own emphasis, and that's okay. There's nothing about that fact that would point to these being sort of fabrications of the authors or anything like that. You know, if you think of even modern biographies, the author has a purpose, right? The author is going to draw the reader's attention to a narrow set of characteristics about the person they're giving a biography on. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that those characteristics aren't true of the person just because the author is drawing our attention to them. It just means the author found those characteristics particularly important to point out. So just keep that in mind. So we'll start with Matthew. Matthew, his main theme is of Jesus as the Messiah of the Old Testament. So Matthew is a Jew, writing probably primarily for Jews, and he's pointing out the importance of Jesus fulfilling Old Testament prophecies. So Jesus is the Redeemer. He's the King of God's kingdom. He's the Messiah. And so you get a lot of emphasis on Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled. Mark highlights Jesus as the Son of Man. And I'm not going to get into what that title means, primarily because I don't fully understand what that title means. It is a title found in the Old Testament, so it has implications. You know, you can look up that title, Son of Man. You can go back into, say, the book of Daniel, and what does the Son of Man mean? And it, whatever it means, Mark thinks that that's important to highlight, that Jesus is he is what that title is applied to, and so he's the Son of Man. But it's an Old Testament term. You know, it could also be kind of this term of humility. Sometimes it's just a term that's synonymous with man. He's just a man. So, but Mark really emphasizes that title of Jesus is the Son of Man. He's also portrayed as a prophet of mighty deeds and words. So he's a guy with power. He's a guy with authority in his speech. So that's Mark's sort of emphasis. Luke emphasizes the human nature of Jesus, really hits home that Jesus was a guy, he was a human. Luke is very historical in his writing. He reads like a historian. He also really emphasizes the compassion that Jesus had for sinners. He's the savior of sinners. One of Luke's emphases. And then John, last of all, emphasizes Jesus as the Son of God. That's plain and simple. He's God's Son. The Word incarnate is kind of a phrase that's a lot to go into, but that phrase comes from John, is that Jesus is the Word of God. So those are your summaries of the books. So we'll get into when these guys are written. So first thing to note is none of the Gospels are dated. They're not time-stamped. They just were not dated by the authors. So that means we have to pull clues from two sources, from one inside the text and then from two things outside the text. Pulling stuff from within the text is a little tough. Like I said, there's no dates given as to when they were written. A few of the books make clear allusions to at least a decent chunk of time having passed since the writing of the book itself. So an example would be when Judas hung himself, the place he hung himself, I forget what the place is called, Field of Blood or Tears, I don't recall, but they say, and that place is called that to this day. And that happens a couple of times where they say something and they say it's still the case today. So that implies that at least a little bit of time has passed. You don't say that about things that were just established, a few days ago, a few weeks ago. Hey, I got a raise yesterday and I'm still at that rate to this day. It just doesn't make sense. Like, it implies some decent chunk of time has passed. It's not very specific about how much time has passed. And I mean, really, there's not a whole lot else to go on within the text. As we look about some facts outside the text, we can kind of pull back into some of the clues from within. So looking outside the text, we talked about the timeline of Jesus. He died around 33. There's some other really big historical events that occur just in secular history, just things that occurred in history that we know about from other sources, not from the Bible. We just know about these events. So the Jewish war and the destruction of the temple is one such huge event. I believe the Jewish war kicked off in about 66. And then the Jewish temple was actually destroyed, I think, as a result of that war in 70. So that's huge because Jesus was a Jew. The people following him were Jews. The things that Jesus did and said changed a lot for the Jewish understanding of the world. A lot changed, but they were still sort of considered Jewish up until around this time. There's a lot of discussion about what is our identity, and when the temple was destroyed, all of that changed. Judaism itself changed. So even the people who just completely dismissed everything about Jesus and Christianity, their entire religion really changed after their temple was destroyed. Their system of sacrifices was no longer in place. They made their sacrifices at the temple, and once it was destroyed, they no longer had a place to offer the sacrifices. And so from that point on, really, Judaism was never the same. I mean, it's kind of hard to overemphasize just how big of a change the destruction of their temple was to their religion. And so that's important as we look at dates and authorship and things like that, because you're going to look for clues. Like, were they aware of this fact yet? Are they kind of making allusions to the destruction of the temple, or does the writing seem oblivious to the fact that any major change has occurred in Judaism whatsoever? And kind of tied in with that is this uptick in Roman persecution of Judaism, of Christianity, the Romans, by and large, left Jews and Christians alone up until, I believe, up until it's getting to like 63, 64. The major persecutors of Christians up until about that time were Jews themselves. The Jews did not like this new sect, and they were the major persecutors. And so I don't recall what was the catalyst for the uptick in Roman persecution, but I believe it was Nero at about 64 to 66. He has his campaign of just death and destruction against Christians, and that's when Peter and Paul were martyred, was in this persecution of Nero. It was in about 64 to 66. So that's a huge historical event that maybe we can pull clues from when we're looking at dates of these texts. Right, so we'll start with Luke, and kind of talk about how the dating of Luke relates to these events. So Luke is tied, his gospel is tied directly to a book that we will look at in a subsequent week called Acts. This is basically a two-part writing. And so the Gospel of Luke, as we said, it goes over the life and ministry of Jesus, and then it ends. And then the book of Acts picks up with Jesus is around for a little bit before he ascends into heaven, and then it just goes over the history of the Christian church for about its first 33 years. And that was all written by the same guy. We'll get into a little bit more when we talk about Acts, but that's very indisputable. They open exactly the same way. They're written to the same person, this guy named Theophilus. Luke and Acts both just open with, "Hey Theophilus, I'm writing you some stuff because it's important for you to know these things." And they're written in very much the same style. Kind of unique, I think, from my understanding of the different writings in the New Testament. It is kind of written in a little bit more of a classical style, a little bit more learned. So it's clearly the same guy. So if we look at when Acts ends, it's important to look at when Acts ends because Luke would have had to have been written before Acts. So as I mentioned, Acts goes over the first 33 years of the Christian church. And it ends with Paul being imprisoned in Rome, and he's just kind of hanging out and teaching people stuff. And then it ends. Well, if we remember that Paul died in a Roman persecution about 64 to 66, somewhere in there, we could probably conclude Acts was written, the writing was finished prior to Paul's death, because Acts goes over everything, every person that was killed, by a Jewish official, all these martyrs. It goes over people that died for the faith. It doesn't talk about Paul at all. It just kind of ends. He's imprisoned in Rome. So it was probably finished up before 64 or 66. So if Acts was finished up at about that time, then Luke had to have been finished up sometime prior. In addition, Luke and some of the other Gospels as well have this friendliness towards Rome. You read them and you don't at all get this sense that Romans are the bad guys. They're nothing to be feared, nothing to be worried about. There's no sense that Rome is after them. And you would kind of expect that in a writing written after Rome starts to persecute them. So that's something to keep in mind. So those are clues that we can relate to that just event in history of Roman persecution and the death of Peter and Paul. Relating to the destruction of the temple, this is something that is prophesied by Jesus in the Gospels. He makes some claims that don't say, hey, the Jewish temple is going to get destroyed, but he makes some claims that are really generally understood to be speaking about things that will happen in the future that include the destruction of the Jewish temple. These are prophecies of things that are going to happen in the future. Now, some scholars, they say, well, that had to have been written after the destruction of the temple because prophecies don't happen. So it had to have been written after. That's a presumption, and you can have that presumption. But the gospel writers, and especially Matthew, love to bring up prophecies and say, look at how Jesus fulfilled that, or look how that came to fruition. And they don't do that with this particular prophecy. They don't at all give the prophecy and then go, and then it happened. Here he prophesies the destruction of the temple, and then now I, the author, I'm going to interject and tell my readers that it actually happened. They do that with other prophecies, but they don't do that with the destruction of the temple. In a lot of ways, they bring their readers up to date, so to speak. They'll say, and that place, like I mentioned earlier, they'll say that place over in the field still holds the same name today. They do interject and say kind of the state of things now when they're writing the gospel, but they don't at all mention the destruction of the temple. So because of all of that, a good chunk of what I've learned is that scholars take at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke to be written in about the 50s or 60s, before the destruction of the temple, before the death of Peter and Paul, because these things are just not present in those gospels. They're just not present at all. Now, John is a little different. The Gospel of John is taken generally to be written in about the 90s, quite a bit later. And that's partially because of its different flavor, because it presents so much new material. Part of it, they think, is, well, all of the material presented in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, everyone already knew that stuff. So if people are pushing him to write a gospel, or if he's feeling compelled to write a gospel, at this point, he's not going to write the same stuff. Whereas, when Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all writing, things were a bit chaotic in the early church, and the literature wasn't dispersed. No one could be sure whether the Gospel of Mark was going to make it all the way across, the Roman Empire for these other folks in this other church to read it. So multiple Gospels were written. But John, if it was written later, that makes sense why there would be so much new material. And as we get into some of these things, it's important to recognize that these are just, some of this stuff is just clues and hints. It doesn't prove that it was written later, but it just kind of fits with a possible later writing. Another thing a bit different about John is when Jews are referred to, they're just referred to as Jews. Whereas in the other three Gospels, it's very careful to say which sect are we talking about. All of these different little sects existed prior to the destruction of the temple. And in John, you don't get that at all. You just get that there's just Jews. And from what I've gathered is that after the destruction of the temple, that's kind of what happened, is they became a bit more of a unity. Their sort of center of faith was destroyed, and as we know, when things are rough, when our world is kind of suddenly crashed in upon, we're not so keen to be sectarian. We're much more of a unity. And so that is another possible clue. Maybe it was written after the destruction of the temple. Another clue is the first three gospels are kind of seem to be careful to keep characters anonymous in some instances. And the thought is, well, maybe that's because early Christians were going around ticking off the Jewish officials, and so the guy in the garden who chops off a Jewish official's ear, well, let's not give his name in our gospel, because the Jews still have power. They still have Judea and their temple, and they still hold sway. When we get to John, he just reveals. He says, "This is Peter." Peter chops that Jewish official's ear off. And so, could it be nothing? Maybe, but it's possibly a clue that that it was written a bit later, is written after the destruction of the temple. Another thing that's said is that John seems to maybe be addressing, in its more instructive flavor, in its more theological nature, that maybe it's addressing a certain heresy called Gnosticism, that maybe this gospel was written not just to convey history and things like that, but in doing that, in telling the story of Jesus, to specifically point out things that combat these false religions that are kind of calling themselves Christian but are just so off base. And if John's gospel was doing that, then it would make sense that it would be later, because that particular sect, that particular heretical group, was at its height later in the century, closer to the 90s. So all that being said, you get a lot of folks in these encyclopedias and these dictionaries and things that they want to give very specific dates. Mark was written in 58, and then you get another entry and say, nope, it was 59. And so for non-academic folks like myself, and like hopefully some people potentially tuning into this later, it's enough to say it's unanimous, nearly unanimous, that all of these gospels were written somewhere between the 40s and the 90s. That's broad. If you really wanted to narrow it down, John was a bit later, Matthew, Mark, and Luke probably a good chunk earlier, very likely prior to 70, sometime in the 60s. So cool, we now know that. You can either take my word for it, or you can go look at some encyclopedia entries and things yourselves, which I would prefer. But hopefully that's exciting to learn kind of when those were written. It's important, if you look back at when Jesus died, he died in 33. So we're talking accounts that are written 20, 30, 40 years after Jesus' death. So, and these things are being written in public with audiences. And so hopefully that will get you thinking in terms of whether these things are true, and who the heck would believe these things, and because because it makes a big difference. If these things were written in 300, 300 years after the fact, we could probably go, well, they're stories, they're just nothing. But the fact that they were written so close to the events they're describing, we kind of have to grapple with that and wonder, okay, if some of this stuff was made up, how did they get away with it? You're gonna have to kind of grapple with that, and so it's very interesting to learn that these things were written so early. You read about not just John. Obviously John is writing in the 90s. He's pretty old. He's not the only one. Just random history. You read about certain martyrs. They were a Christian for 86 years. Before they died. I mean, there's some old folks hanging around at the end of the century that were there for some of this stuff, and so it's kind of cool to have a bit of a three-dimensional view of some of this history. So we'll talk about authorship. I think authorship is a lot less exciting, but important. So none of the Gospels were signed. They were all written anonymously. And I wrote in my notes, gasp, gasp. They weren't signed. How can we know who wrote these things? But it isn't that exciting. Biographies just weren't signed. They weren't, authors were not included in their works. At that time when biographies were made, it was kind of like our modern encyclopedia entries, dictionaries. You've got an encyclopedia and it's got an editor on the front page, but I think most encyclopedias, maybe it's more common now, but they typically don't have an author attributed to them. It's just, that's the subject. It is what it is. That's the truth. And so it's kind of thought, if I write, well, this is the gospel according to so-and-so, then people are going to think, well, it's like my gospel, that it's something unique to my head, but it's not. It's just stuff that happened. So biographies just weren't signed. So it was nothing too exciting that these were written anonymously. But what we do know is that the authors ascribed to them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were all ascribed to these letters by tradition. And what does that mean? I'll admit, when I read something in a textbook or whatever, and it says, according to tradition, such and such was the case, I groan and I say, oh, well, that probably wasn't the case, or who knows if that was the case. It's just according to tradition. But it's interesting to read about the authorship of these gospels and to realize what that means. What does it mean that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were traditionally held to be the authors of these gospels? Well, what it means is those books were ascribed to those authors starting in the early 100s. So we're talking, 50, 100 year, somewhere between 10 and 50 years after these things were written. You have every single person, Christian, non-Christian, ascribing these gospels to these authors. So in year 110, you get a guy that says, yep, they're all written, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In year 140, you get someone, that gospel written by Matthew, and that other one by Mark, and that other one by Luke, and then one by John. Not all authors maybe allude to all the gospels. Some of them do. But you get tons and tons of people saying these were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there's really no reason for them to lie. And there's no one else claiming they've been written by anyone else. There's no disagreement. There's no other church somewhere that says, no, that gospel was written by Barnabas, or that gospel was written by so-and-so. There's just no dispute about who wrote these things. And I lost my train of thought. So we get that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew, who was an apostle of Jesus. We get, and let me just say, part of why there's no reason to lie. For example, Matthew was an apostle, yes, but not a very like prominent apostle. He's not exactly all that famous as far as an apostle goes. He's just kind of one of them. And then you have Mark, which is attributed to this guy named Mark, who is not an apostle. Mark was the apostle Peter's interpreter, which could either mean his literal interpreter of languages or the guy who kind of compiled stories from Peter and put them into this gospel. But whoever he wasn't an apostle. He was a companion of an apostle, which is great. It means he's not just some guy. He's getting this stuff from an apostle. But to attribute it to a Mark, if someone was just going to make up an author, they would just say, well, this is Peter's gospel. But they don't do that. They say it's this guy Mark who hung out Peter and was his interpreter, wrote a bunch of stuff down, probably from Peter. Luke's gospel is written by a guy named Luke, who is also not an apostle. They call him like Luke the physician or Luke the historian. He's kind of this learned guy, a medical guy, and he was Paul's companion. So again, it does kind of have this apostle behind it. Paul is a huge guy in the church, but it wasn't written by Paul. No one says it was written by Paul. It was written by this guy Luke who hung out with Paul. And then John's gospel was written by John the apostle, and John was a pretty big deal apostle. He was kind of one of the closer apostles to Jesus, and so it is kind of the one with sort of the highest pedigree there, John's gospel. So that's our authors. It's pretty unanimous. Nothing too exciting with disputes or anything about who potentially wrote those. So I would say that's the biggest, if you want to say, argument in favor of who wrote these, is just everyone says so. Every historian, every person in the church, people outside the church, Jews, Greeks, simply say these are the guys who wrote it. We know this, and the guys who would have known these authors were around and would have probably spoken up if that was inaccurate. And so it's just really nothing that can be argued with. So if you see that, according to tradition, it's really nothing to be too scared about. It's kind of like very reasonable, actually. So there are some kind of fun, exciting hints and clues if you want to get into some more maybe additional reasons for taking these authors to be the actual authors. One of the more fun ones is the humility that is presented in these Gospels. So if the authors ascribed to these Gospels really wrote them, it just so happens that most of them show a bit of humility in regards to that character. So like, let's just say Matthew. Matthew is the only gospel that refers to the apostle Matthew as a tax collector, which was kind of a nasty thing to be. People did not like tax collectors. They were corrupt. They took more money than they were required to take. They were not good. And so in the Gospel of Matthew, supposedly written by Matthew, you get this presentation of Matthew as having once been kind of a scurvy guy. So that fits with the general character of Christianity, which is personal humility. You get it with Mark as well. If Mark is writing Peter's thoughts, in Mark's gospel, you get a presentation of Peter in the most humble of light. Really hammers home Peter's denial of Jesus. When people ask, "Hey, Peter, aren't you with that Jesus guy who we're dragging to get crucified?" He says, "No, I'm not with that guy. It's not me." That portrait we get from this Gospel of Mark, and if Mark's getting this from Peter, then he's getting this kind of humble presentation. And then with John's Gospel, he just goes out of his way to not mention himself. He'll say the apostle whom Jesus loved, and all of this, and it's almost awkwardly worded to avoid even mentioning himself, because he is such a prominent apostle. He's in the scenes, but he's kind of leaving his name out of it. He doesn't seem to want to be this kind of name dropper. So a few other things, we noted, like Luke is a historian, he's a physician. His wording, he seems very interested in the historical facts, in the travel aspects, who's going where and when, certain medical terminology. He's interested in sort of healing miracles. And again, it just fits with an author, that Luke being the author. I don't think anyone should look at those facts and go, well, that proves Luke's the author. But it definitely fits in it, and it's interesting to learn. So last thing I just had was that Mark's gospel, who we're getting Peter's thoughts in Mark's gospel. You almost do get Peter's thoughts, when you're reading a book, and you read in there, well, so and so thought X, Y, and Z. You think, well, how did they know what they were thinking? They had to have been pretty close to them. And so sometimes we get Peter's thoughts in Mark, and we get the most scenes of the closest three apostles to Jesus. Peter's one of them. We get the most of those scenes in the Gospel of Mark. And we get these close-ups of what's happening there behind the scenes when it's just those three apostles hanging out with Jesus. You wouldn't really expect to get those types of scenes if you're getting your information from an apostle like Matthew, who's never invited into those more private, small gatherings. So those are just some kind of fun things, really cool to discover. But again, just kind of take them as clues and hints that fit with the traditional authorship that's ascribed to them. So I've talked for way longer, I think, than I intended. Way longer than I intended. So I'll open it up to discussion. But that's all I've got on the four Gospels.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, got it. First of all, I thought you did a very thorough job of presenting that material, and you did it in a straightforward and apprehendable way. And I applaud you for having done it that way. I had one question, and that is the dating of Jesus' birth at 0.
Yes.
Where do you get that, except from the fact that that's where the calendar starts? What sources do you have for that?
I don't have any sources. That's kind of why I said 0. Some people put it at 3. I didn't do any direct research on that. I think it's just important for people to know.
Okay.
Generally, whether it's 0 or 3, right about in there is when he was born. 30 years later,
Sure.
started his ministry. 3 years later, he died. There was one thing I read that said his death was in 33, which I assume then if you backtrack, that source would have taken his birth to be at 0. And I don't know what resource that was, but it was a reputable one.
Right. Right.
But
Yeah.
I haven't
The
looked into that portion like in detail.
okay. Okay. All right. And I understand that it's not really directly relevant to what you're doing here. I just was wondering about that because I personally and professionally put his birth probably closer to 3 BC actually.
Oh, 3 BC. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And so he actually was executed in around 30. That's my take on it. But
Okay.
of course, that's based on the several people that I've read and looked at their arguments and weighed them out and find which ones which were most weighty or not. But again, I understand for the purposes of what you're doing here, it's not that relevant per se directly.
Yeah.
Although if you're talking about like when Luke, was written, of course it had to be, the material it started while he was still alive, while in his resurrected state. And so, we know that the material that he's covering is links at some point in time to after he was alive, after his execution. So,
Right.
but again, just wondering. That's all.
Yeah, and I'll bet you. Yeah, now that you say that, I knew it was 0 or 3, but I had it in my head as 0 or 3 AD. I probably just misunderstood as some other people thinking.
Yeah, I don't know of many who put it at 3 AD. Most of them put it between 3 and 5 BC is where most of them will put that.
Okay.
So okay.
I got what Google says.
Yeah.
What's Google say, Kyle?
It says Jesus began to preach after being baptized by John the Baptist, and based on Luke's gospel, John only began the baptizing people in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius.
Tiberius. Yeah.
Luke 3, 1-2, which scholars estimate to have been in AD 28-29. Then you subtract 30 years, and it appears Jesus was born in 1-2 BC. So that is also saying BC.
1 to 2 BC. Right.
Okay, yeah, but I've heard what you said, Dustin. 0 to 380 is what most people go with. But, well, I mean, I guess now they got something different.
Somewhere thereabouts.
Yeah.
The guy was born.
Also, I just wanted to add in, I like at the beginning you started with the Gospels. You described it as like Jesus's biography. And I was like, that's a good way to put it because like, I know what a biography is. And then everybody else describes the Gospels kind of differently. And it's never really been clear. But if you say like a biography, like most people know what that is. And you can relate it easily to what, story of Jesus. So
I
like that part.